All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. They tested the mic volume, so we should be good, but if you can't hear, just yell. I need to conduct a survey before we get rolling. Who in the room is a dairy producer? Let's start there, okay? All right. What about nutritionists? Great. Hopefully we have answers for all of you. That's the goal. So today I'm here to talk to you about finding the next bump in your paycheck. So that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. Hopefully we find something that fits for everyone today as a take-home message. I want to start out with more questions because I think this is really important. When we start diving into looking at how to find the next bump in our paycheck, we need to make sure that we know how we're allocating our paycheck, right? We need to make sure that we understand what our purchase feed cost is. So in a former life, I was a nutritionist as well, and when I asked my customers how much their feed cost, oh, well, I don't know. Okay, well, let's start with your purchase feed cost. That's usually an easier number because I gave it to you when we started, and people can resonate with that, so that tracks, right? How about homegrown feed costs? When you ask customers or dairy producers what their homegrown feed costs are, it's not uncommon to get, what did my neighbor tell you? What kind of numbers are you hearing in the industry? And my challenge to that is, are you using actual numbers or are you managing the average farm, right? Is it more important to know your numbers or is it more important to know the average? I was talking to a banker, an ag banker, before this talk to make sure that I wasn't out of line in some of my questions. And one of the things that she challenged me on was making sure that we understand what the real costs are for our farms, not for the average farm. We also need to keep things like inventory in consideration. Forage inventory, being able to cover our needs for the year, for a year and a half, whatever that looks like on your farms, that's important, but there's also an associated cost to carrying that inventory, right? So we need to make sure we track that. How about shrink, right? Do we have a real number there? Intake numbers, how many people can give an accurate dry matter intake number? Hopefully we're getting closer and hopefully we're getting really good numbers for that, but I think it's really something that we need to take into consideration, which brings me to my last comment about refusals, right? When we're talking about what our feed costs are, do we take that into consideration as far as what the value of those refusals are? Or are we just assuming that because we're feeding that to heifers, that it's a sunk cost, right? I think taking all of those things into consideration when we talk about how do we find the next couple pennies, where do we add value, all of those things are important. I found this, actually one of my wonderful coworkers sent me this morning. It was just recently in Hordes. Really interesting to think about this, and even as a nutritionist, I had never put a value to this number with my customers. So what we're looking at is if we assume the average feed cost is $7.50, which probably not, but somebody else's number, so we'll stick with it. If we assume that, and then we have, a range of 10% refusals down to 1% refusal, certainly if you can manage your refusals a lot tighter, there's a huge opportunity to save money on the dairy, right? It's not an income, but the difference between $500,000 and $50,000 is a pretty big number when we look at the 2,000 cow herd, right? So I think we need to take all of these things into consideration as we're decision making on our dairies. Now, we'll take a second to think about this. Do our feed costs matter? I'd always been challenged, let's reduce our feed costs. Let's really try to dig down, to cut costs, to find areas of opportunity to make sure that we are saving ourselves into prosperity. I challenge you that maybe that's not the right approach. I don't think that saving into prosperity gets us where we want to go. Rather, let's think about adding some value. Graphs might be a little small, but hopefully you can all make this out. This was published in 2014, so we're about 10 years old now. But what this is showing actually in the right-hand panel is income over feed cost, and the left-hand panel of those graphs is milk yield. Now we're looking at the years 2019 to 2012 on average, or 2009 to 2012 in the first chunk of bars, and then it's split out by year, 2009, 10, and 11 in the next three groupings of bars. So what we're demonstrating with these figures is that black bar in particular, the feed cost there ranges anywhere from $6.25 to $9.25 per cow per day. What's interesting, and you can see in the bars, is that as feed cost goes up, production generally follows. And there is a significant difference in what production looks like when we get into those higher cost diet groupings. And it's always a struggle, right? I don't want to just buy milk. I don't want to swap dollars around. But if you look all the way to the right in that first set of bars, on average, that dark black bar is showing a significant improvement in income over feed costs for cows on the higher diet. So that's taking into consideration what our feed costs are and what the value of our milk is. So as we move higher to higher diet costs, we definitely can see some value. This isn't a new concept, right? We're talking about it today, it's 2024. I'm not the best at math, but this paper was published in 1976, quite a few years ago. And at this point, they're even showing in the figure that when cows who are high producing cows are fed to their potential, the return on income over feed cost is substantially higher than cows that are fed to a lower cost strategy. So the quote that I love, because I've probably said this to my customers in the past, is even when feed cost is high, cutting costs is not necessarily the answer. Let's look for other strategies. So how do we package this together for something that's useful and really able to bring value back to the dairy? We'll start talking more and more about income over feed costs as we move through this discussion. And for our purposes, we're looking at what your income is minus what the feed costs are, right? Pretty simple equation. We're using this as a metric for evaluating profitability of the feeding program. We're capturing, hopefully, an accurate picture of the total value rather than just the total cost of your nutrition program. And our goal then is to maximize income over feed costs, right? If we can accomplish that, then our chances for success and profitability on the dairy are much higher. What kind of tools do we have in our toolbox to accomplish or achieve this goal of increasing income over feed costs? So I think some of them are fairly obvious, fairly standalone ideas, right? But if we can improve production, we should be able to increase income over feed costs, right? We're getting more milk. That milk has a value to us, and we're able to capitalize on that. What about improving components? Most of the U.S. is paid on a component-based market, right? So if we can make progress in increasing our milk fat, then certainly there's an opportunity to increase our income. Reducing feed costs, strategy, I've already told you it's maybe not my preferred one, but it's still a strategy, right? It's still something to be considered. And then last, what about improving feed efficiency? If we can improve feed efficiency, so more pounds of milk for the same amount of feed, or less feed intake but the same amount of milk, are we at an economic advantage? And I would challenge us to think about making that adjustment is really going to help us drive our income over feed costs, and therefore our profitability. But in order to do all that, we really need to take into consideration quite a lot of information. Production, components. You can pretty much ask every dairy farmer out there how much milk he's making. Might not get the truth, but hopefully we get a good number, right? Hopefully we're getting an accurate measure of how our cows are responding to what the dietary inputs are. We can use that information and components to help us make decisions about what intake needs to be, how much are our cows eating. I like to take a lot of time to talk about rumen fermentation. That's an area I'm quite passionate in, but not everybody wants to get into that much detail, so I won't torture you today. Another important consideration is the time frame for a response, right? So we put a lot of feed ingredients in our diets that don't necessarily show a change overnight. A lot of that relates back to the fact that there's a change in rumen fermentation or the rumen bacterial population that has to occur before we see the maximum response. There's other reasons for that too. What about the cost to implement, right? So if we start thinking about what our feed costs are or a management change that we want to account for, we really have to look at how that's going to affect the bigger picture, right? Labor costs to implement a change, other management things, and milk price all plays a role in how we make decisions to improve profitability. So there's a lot of background on things that are important to consider, but we haven't really talked about tools or strategies to get there yet, right? So in my head, I break this out into a handful of different approaches. Management changes, forage changes, feed additives. You could probably toss out a handful more, but we only have 45 minutes, so we'll keep it a little bit focused on these approaches and these strategies, right? So as we work through the talk, each of these will become more relevant and more apparent as to how they can help us improve income over feed costs. So first, grouping strategies and the responses for income over feed costs. Now this is something, when I first started putting all this information together, in my head, I understand that this is a strategy to improve our income over feed costs. What I didn't know is that a lot of people had actually done the research, right? Shown the economic value. This paper was published in 2019. Lots of numbers, kind of small, but focus on the bottom line of the table. That's the average of 7 farms where the researchers, and this came out of Wisconsin, the researchers were actually able to look at a 1-group feeding strategy versus a 2-group versus a 3-group. Now, the opt group and cluster, those are not totally relevant for the conversation, but the point is that as we move from a 1-group to a 2-group to a 3-group feeding strategy, each one of those income over feed costs increase. So moving from 1 group to 2 groups, improved income over feed costs. 2 groups to 3 groups, income over feed costs. You shook your head, tell me why. No? Okay, you're not buying it yet, maybe we'll get there. All right, so I think it's really important to think about this, right? So we get a lot of challenges on, well, it cost me some time, right? To make 2 mixes instead of 3. Or I don't have the facilities, right? To split out and make 2 groups. I might only be able to manage, 1 group TMRs. And that's okay, but this is one strategy where we actually finally have some real data looking at what happens. Similarly, and this one is fun, this was 2022. So this paper had a series of graphs that look all the same as this, but things do really, really crazy, wild stuff. Lots of colors and lots of numbers to look at here. Now, what we're looking at, so focus on the top set of lines for now. Those diamonds that are blue, what we see is the observed income over feed cost for this dairy, for this situation, right? Now, when we get to day 0, right there in the middle, they changed the cows to a different pen. With that change, they tracked what happened to income over feed cost, right? So oftentimes, and this breaks it out quite a few different ways, but what happens is they change the diets to support the level of production, right? So if we're going from a high cow pen to, I call it a maintenance pen, because nobody wants a low group, right? Nobody wants a low group. So if we change that diet from a high group diet to a maintenance group, what happens to income over feed cost? A lot of people get nervous about that. There's a lot of hesitation to do that because anytime we interrupt what's going on with our cows, there is an opportunity for fluctuation. So the open triangles in the top bar represent what happened with income over feed cost. What was predicted to happen was in the closed green triangles. So what we can see is that when we actually made that pen change, those cows had higher income over feed costs than if we had left them on the same diet or in the same pen. So there's a lot of reasons for that, right? So this could be related to what the diet cost was, right? So if we move them from a high cow diet that has all the goodies and all the feed additives that everybody gets to put in when the cows are making a lot of milk and milk price is good, that diet's a lot more expensive. When we can back out some of those higher expense ingredients, but either maintain production or at least not have a large hit, we actually have a huge opportunity to be able to maximize our income over feed costs. Now, what I'm not showing you, because we only show the good stuff, what I'm not showing you is this can backfire, right? If you're not appropriately balancing the diet and you lose a substantial amount of production, you're not going to gain income, right? Your income over feed cost doesn't necessarily go up. So it's important to work with your professionals and make sure that we're actually paying attention to the numbers so that we make these decisions work on our farms. But it's cool that there's actually data for this now. So switching gears completely, right? Let's talk about forages. Does anyone grow BMR? Or have customers that grow BMR? No, no one's going to admit to it. All right. So, fine then. Don't play along. All right. So we could talk about this from the context of BMR, or we could talk about this from the context of grass versus legume silages, or small grain silages, right? So think about from BMR corn silage. Why do we grow it? Improved digestibility, right? So when you put up that feed, do we keep it separate? Or do we say, oh, I'm going to go on the same pile because we only have space for one corn silage bunk? If we do that, we still have some opportunity for economic responses, but we don't necessarily capture the full magnitude, right? So when we're making these forage decisions, it's important to take into consideration what the goals are for the diet. You can argue that not all cows on the farm need that BMR corn silage. Can we allocate that to a better population of animals so that we're actually having the response that we wanted with those girls? If we mix it into one pile, we can't do that, right? Grasses versus legumes. This was one of my really fun projects right before I came to Novus, was looking at what happens when we add grass haylage into the diet versus alfalfa haylage. It's not, where I live, it's not super easy to put up good alfalfa haylage, or dry hay for that matter, because it rains too much. We can't get in the field when we need to get it out. And our digestibilities are average at best, probably better than in Florida, if anyone milks there, but we don't do a great job getting it in the bunk when we need to because the weather fights us. When we look at what the change in digestibility is from a grass to a legume, there's a large variation in that number. The more we can improve digestibility, the more economic value we have in getting to how we maximize income over feed costs. Couple of notes on that so that you don't have to trust me, you can trust other people who have done a lot of work on this. When we increase, so Mike Allen, I came out of his lab in grad school, but Mike Allen did a lot of research on how NDF digestibility affects milk production, right? And he says that a unit increase in NDF digestibility, either in vitro, so in a lab in a test tube, or in situ in the cow, actually can increase dry matter intake some and also lead to a half-pound increase in milk production. Do you see a half pound of milk in the bulk tank? No. you might see 4, right? And if you get a 4-unit difference in NDF digestibility on the diet, you certainly start to see that response. John Gazer, who works with Rock River Lab, followed up on that work with a survey of farms in Wisconsin, where he was actually able to see a similar trend, although milk production responses were greater in his survey than they were in that earlier work from Mike Allen's lab. Now, we could argue a lot of reasons for why that is, but one of the most important is that, 1, we probably do a better job of balancing diets now, and 2, our cow's genetic potential is higher. So if we can get more digestible forage, digestible fiber into her, we have a greater opportunity to make improvements. I know nobody in the room ever had to work with anyone or ever put up poor quality forage, but here's a management challenge, right? We know that sometimes our corn silage gets too dry, or it sits in the field the corn sits in the field too long before we can chop. We know when we're waiting on the custom guy, just watching that field, right? We can't get after it. We lose value of that silage because we lose digestibility. This work came out of Rick Grant's lab up at Miner Institute before he got the pleasure of retiring. And what it's showing is 2 different dietary levels of UNDF, 240, which is a measure of indigestible fiber. And what we can see with that, when you split out either low NDF or high NDF, underneath each of those headings is a low physically effective NDF number or a high physically effective NDF number. So think about that with respect to particle length, right? Shorter particles versus longer particles. What happens when we feed a longer particle? I tell you that she doesn't ruminate more, right? She eats longer, and that takes her so longer at the bunk, but then also less opportunity for her to get back, lay in the stall, and make milk and do something more productive with her time. NOVUS has a C.O.W.S program, which is a really cool tool to utilize to evaluate how dynamics from a cow behavior standpoint at the feed bunk might affect production, but also looking at other benchmarks on the farm, right, or bottlenecks on the farm. I think this is a really cool piece of research that kind of sums up what we can see in some of these, or how we can manage through some of these overcrowding situations, right? If we have a forage that is high indigestible fiber, and then we chop it smaller, we actually see that there can be a recovery on milk production. So look at the 102 pounds on the shorter particle size with poor quality fiber sources in the diet versus 98 pounds, 102 versus 98 pounds of energy corrected milk, right? It's a pretty big difference just because we changed the chop size. We allowed the cow to get in, eat her feed, get back, lay down, and do her job. Make us milk so that we can make money. So we can manage around some of these challenges that we face. We just have to understand what's driving the biology of the cow to get there. Okay. What about feed additives? Everyone likes feed additives, right? Because you put all of them in that everybody talks to you about, and you get 25 extra pounds of milk, right? And it saves the day. I think there's some truth to what feed additives do to us, what they bring to the table, right? But we have to be selective. So for this discussion, let's talk about things that improve feed efficiency, because that's a really great way to improve income over feed cost. Products that can do that for us, monensin, yeast, probiotics, essential oils, there's probably a whole host of other things that I could add to this list, but as a starting point, we can use these feed additives to bring us value from a feed efficiency standpoint, right? If we can optimize dry matter intake, and notice I didn't necessarily say reduce dry matter intake, I said optimize dry matter intake, and maximize milk production, we get that seesaw working just right. By using some of these feed additives, we can certainly make a difference on our income over feed cost. So, how do we do that? So ruminal fermentation is a huge key for this, right? We can't get something for nothing. I've never been successful in that strategy, right? But we can use these feed additives tools to help alter rumen fermentation to allow for more efficient energy utilization and production. Ruminal VFA profiles are super important when we consider what happens from a milk yield and a component production standpoint. And we've already talked about how important component yields are for driving profitability. One of the challenges we see is when we affect dry matter intake, right, which maybe that's how we improve feed efficiency, we reduce dry matter intake. Do we lose body condition when we do that, or body weight? Because if we're using the cow's energy reserves to help maximize production, we're not doing ourselves any favors when it comes to getting her pregnant down the line, right? I think that's huge. So whatever tool you're using, make sure that we're keeping an eye on what happens from a body condition, body weight standpoint. I didn't make this, so I can't take credit for it, but it's cool. When you put the words like, start talking about feed intake, feed efficiency, income over feed cost, these are some of the words that pop up in our searches that we see all the time. And one of the largest things there, right, is dry matter intake. So focus on dry matter intake is critically important. Now, remember that in order to get an appropriate dry matter intake for our cows, we also need to know how much she's leaving behind in the bunk. We need intake, we need feed drop, feed left over, we need to weigh it, we need to understand what it is, and we should really know that on a dry matter value, because water doesn't do us a whole lot of favors except allowing us to stick the feed together so she gets a more consistent bite every time. So I'll take a second just to talk through an example of a feed additive that can improve feed efficiency, right? So one of our goals for the dairy is to try to maximize milk yield, right? We can do that if we improve propionate production. We could give you a whole laundry list of ways that propionate's of value to the dairy cow, and I spend an awful lot of time infusing it into dairy cows in my time, but we make some really big strides when we can increase that propionate production in the rumen by using some of these feed additives that we have available. If we do that, we can increase the cow's energy balance and increase her milk yield and milk quality at the same time. So how do we do that? So cow eats, right? And all that feed comes into her rumen. She starts digesting that feed, and that TMR then is converted into propionate, acetate, and butyrate primarily. Now, what happens from there gets into some complicated biochemistry that I won't drag you guys through because I care, but propionate leaves the rumen and it gets to the liver. Once it's in the liver, it can be converted into glucose, which helps drive milk production, or it can be oxidized as a fuel in the liver, right? So oxidation of propionate gives us energy, but it doesn't, it can spare body condition, it can spare other nutrients to drive production, but the most effective thing that we can do with that propionate is get it converted to glucose to help drive milk production. So the glucose bounced over to the mammary gland. If we get more glucose or glucose precursors to the mammary gland, we can convert that to lactose, convert that into milk production, right? The flip side of that coin is if we oxidize propionate, it generates some energy, right, for the cow, and it sends this message to the cow's brain that she doesn't need to eat anymore. You can effectively slow intake by oxidizing more propionic acid coming to the liver from the rumen. If we do that, that signal from the brain heads down to the mouth, feeds back to what the cow is eating and how she's utilizing or how she's making that decision to get up to the feed bunk or go lay down. If we stop the intake or reduce intake by driving this propionic acid production, we can actually reduce dry matter intake and help that cow become a more profitable animal for you. All right, so from here, let's look at some information, some data from, I'm using one of our products as an example because I'm not promoting anybody else's stuff while we're standing here, but let's think about this, right? So from a milk yield increase, who doesn't want more milk? Anyone? Great. So everybody knows that more milk is important, right? So this slide's showing a summary of what happens when we add this product that improves feed efficiency into our diet. So There's some couple of bold numbers in there, right? We're looking at either primiparous, multiparous, or all parities. And what we see is that dependent on the situation, dependent on the trial, sometimes we have an increase in milk production. On average, just shy of 3 pounds, okay? Still hard to pick 3 pounds out in the bulk tank. However, we still know that there's some value to that milk, right? So now, let's take a step back. Think about any feed additive that you are adding to the diet, right? So the partial budget. This is pretty key to making informed decisions about what we're going to do on the dairy and how we're going to add value and track income over feed costs. So we need to use these tools to decide if the strategy that we've selected has actually been of value to us, right? So if we're looking at the top of the table, shows our average milk price per pound, looks at feed cost per pound of dry matter. I picked 16 cents, could have been anything, right? And then the cost of additive X. Additive X is anything that we want it to be. So I gave you an example where we had a just over 2 pound increase in milk production. So if we look at no additive versus additive, we go from 95 to 97 pounds of milk. And if dry matter intake stays the same, we can see that there's a difference in income over feed costs on the bottom there of, is anyone really good at math? Because I'm not. 54 cents, okay? That 54 cents per cow per day adds up really fast, right? Probably don't see it in the bulk tank though, okay? What about decreasing dry matter intake? Set up the same way, we see a couple more bolded numbers, right? Now I'll challenge you to think about how do we capture this value, right? If we reduce dry matter intake on average by 2 pounds, is that economically relevant? Do we make a difference to the dairyman? Do we care? As a nutritionist, I think that's a huge number. If I can account for that difference in dry matter intake and capture it on the farm, how do we capture it on a farm? We have to have a really good number for refusals too, right? We can't just say, ooh, cows didn't eat well today and the pile's bigger. That doesn't work, right? So we have to actually pay attention to what our refusals look like to be able to capture that 2 pounds of feed. So back to our example, same setup of the whole table. Now we're looking at income over feed costs by saving 2 pounds of feed. If we're at 16 cents per pound of dry matter, that's a 32-cent advantage. And I kept milk production the same in this scenario, right? So now, instead of 54 cents, we're at 27 cents. However, when you track what that 2 pounds looks like over the course of the year for one cow, or over the course of the year on your 100 cow or 1,000 cow or 20,000 cow dairy, that number gets really big really fast, and we can capture what that number looks like. Even if we don't gain any production, we can still capture value to the dairy by tracking that feed intake response. So what happens if, same setup, same scenario, but now we get 1.5 pounds less feed and 1.5 pounds more milk, right? Are we better off with that, or are we better off with just more milk volume or just less feed intake, right? So now instead of 54 or 27 cents, we're looking at 51 cents, right? Because cows don't always read the textbooks. We don't always just get either more milk or less feed intake, right? Sometimes we get something in the middle, and it's okay to acknowledge that that's what happens. In some of our work with our products, we see that heifers respond differently than mature cows, right? And I think that's huge too. If you just think about the dairy as a unit, are we missing opportunities? So take a step back to the conversation about how we group our cows. Do we group our heifers in a separate pen? Do we group our high cows different from our low cows? And how do we really capture that value? So 2 more slides. We're going to end a couple minutes early, but I think that what we need to focus on here is how does changing feed efficiency as an opportunity for capturing value on your farm how do we maximize income over feed costs using feed efficiency metrics, right? Are we collecting the right information? Because if we can't accurately describe what our feed costs are, if we can't accurately describe what our dry matter intakes are, then there's no way to know if we've made an impact or not, right? So back to, are we managing our farms? Are we managing the average farm? Where are we at in the middle on that? And are we using the right information to make decisions? We have to use real feed costs for your dairy, costs of production of that homegrown forage. Purchase feed costs are a whole different story, right? We're still probably not accounting for shrink in some of our calculations, but we need to start taking that step. What else does it mean? Can we milk fewer cows and get the same income? Maybe. Can we milk more cows on less land? Right? I work with a lot of dairies in the Northeast that have tiny, tiny fields. They support 7 or 8 or 10,000 cows on fields that average 15 acres. It's really hard to put up forage on those fields and have any sort of consistency, right? There's other areas of the country, here's one of them, that's a whole different story, but it's important to take those things into consideration, right? Can we get more for less? Can we do better? And how do we capture that information? So, multiple ways to capture and manage your dairies into a more profitable scenario. Don't just pigeonhole yourself into thinking about one, right? Take a feed additive and add it to a pen grouping strategy change, and imagine how much more profitable we can make that dairy today, right? If we're capturing value from all of those situations. Knowing your costs is essential. Use partial budgets, right? We did tons of those when I was growing up in school, but it's hard to get that to stick until you're talking about real numbers for our dairies that we're working with. And then last, just again, consider grouping strategies, forage types, feed efficiency, feed additives that are going to help drive those differences. So with that, I'll leave it there. We can talk some more about any questions. I was hoping you guys would pepper more at me, but guess I didn't give you that opportunity. So feel free to ask questions, and I would love to know more about what's working and what's not in your situations. Nothing, not even from you. You made faces the whole time. Nothing. All right. I'll stop picking on you.